A millionaire wanted to help a little boy crying on the side of the road. However, the millionaire took aback when the boy revealed his origin. The streets of Philadelphia were a canvas of muted greys and silvers, painted by the relentless drizzle that blurred streetlights into soft orbs. The quiet hum of Daniel's Audi filled the silence as he navigated the winding back roads of a less traveled part of the city. At 38, Daniel exuded a quiet authority, his tailored coat and salt-and-pepper hair hinting at his success. His life was a symphony of meetings, investments, and high-stakes negotiations, an endless climb that left little time for distractions. But the sound of crying pierced through the hum of his engine. A thin, high-pitched wail, raw with desperation, forced him to slow. Daniel frowned, scanning the street. There, under the weak glow of a flickering lamppost, sat a small figure huddled against the brick wall of a corner store. He pulled over, switching off the ignition, and sat for a moment. Rain dripped rhythmically onto his windshield as he debated. It wasn't his habit to help strangers, but that cry's tremor unsettled him. Grabbing his umbrella, he stepped out, the chill biting through his coat. As he approached, the figure became clearer. A boy, perhaps 8 or 9, his knees drawn to his chest, his face buried in his arms. His thin jacket clung to him, utterly inadequate against the cold. Daniel crouched a few feet away, lowering himself to the boy's level. "Hey," Daniel began, his voice low but firm. "Are you all right?" The boy flinched, his head snapping up. Wide blue eyes, red-rimmed from tears, locked onto Daniel with suspicion. He shifted slightly, pressing his back harder against the wall. "Go away," the boy said, his voice hoarse but defensive. "I'm fine." Daniel studied him for a moment. Fine wasn't the word for a child trembling in the rain, cheeks streaked with tears. He opened the umbrella fully, angling it to shield them both from the drizzle. "You're soaking wet," Daniel said gently, ignoring the protest. "Let's get you somewhere warm." "No." The boy scrambled to his feet, his small frame stiff with tension. "I don't need your help." "All right," Daniel replied evenly, standing but keeping his distance. "But it's cold out here. At least take this." He shrugged off his overcoat, holding it out. The boy hesitated, his eyes darting between the coat and Daniel's face. "I don't want anything from you," the boy muttered, though his gaze lingered on the warm fabric. Daniel sighed, kneeling again to meet his level. "Listen, kid. You don't have to tell me anything, and I'm not here to cause trouble. But you're shivering, and if you stay out here, you'll get sick." For a long moment, the boy didn't move. Then, as if deciding it was safer to accept than to argue, he grabbed the coat with trembling hands and pulled it tightly around himself. The material engulfed him completely. "What's your name?" Daniel asked, his tone casual. "Mark," the boy mumbled, pulling the coat's collar up as though it could shield him further. "I'm Daniel," he replied. He said, "You don't have to talk to me if you don't want to, but sitting here in the rain won't help anyone. Do you have somewhere to go?" Mark's eyes darted away, his fingers tightening on the coat. "I ran away." The words came out so softly that Daniel barely caught them over the sound of the rain. He waited, sensing there was more. Mark's voice cracked. He bit his lip, his small shoulders tensing. "I heard them talking about selling kids at the orphanage." Daniel froze, the gravity of the words sinking in. "Selling kids?" he repeated carefully. Mark nodded, his gaze fixed firmly on the wet pavement. "I don't know if they saw me. I didn't know what else to do. So I left." Daniel inhaled slowly, steadying himself. This was no ordinary runaway story. He looked at Mark's face, pale, gaunt, and etched with fear, and made a decision. "All right, Mark," he said quietly. "You did the right thing by getting away. Let's get you somewhere safe. We'll figure this out together." Mark hesitated, but allowed Daniel to gently guide him toward the car. Once inside, Daniel cranked the heat, glancing at the boy who sat rigidly in the passenger seat. He kept one hand on the oversized coat, as if it were a lifeline, his other clutching the seatbelt tightly. As Daniel pulled back onto the road, Mark kept glancing over his shoulder, his small face twisted in worry. "What if they come after me?" he whispered. "They won't," Daniel said, his voice firm. "I'll make sure of it." Mark didn't reply, but as the car rumbled forward, his grip on the seatbelt loosened slightly. Daniel's jaw tightened as he focused on the road ahead, silently resolving to protect this boy, no matter what lay ahead. The rain had eased by the time Daniel pulled into the sweeping driveway of his home, the grand structure looming under a canopy of wet shadows. Warm light spilled from the windows, but the silence inside the house, broken only by the echo of their footsteps, felt cavernous. Mark trailed behind Daniel, hesitantly, his small figure dwarfed by the expansive entryway. Daniel set his keys on a sleek marble table and gestured toward a leather couch in the living room. "You can sit there," he said gently. "I'll grab you something warm to drink." Mark nodded, still clutching his damp jacket. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the muted opulence, artwork on the walls, bookshelves brimming with hardcovers, and the faint aroma of wood polish. Despite the warmth radiating from the fireplace, the house seemed cold, as if all its grandeur couldn't mask the emptiness within. Daniel returned with a steaming mug of hot chocolate. "Here," he said, placing it on the table in front of Mark. "It'll help." Mark hesitated before taking it, his hands trembling slightly. He glanced up at Daniel, who had settled into an armchair across from him, studying the boy with a careful mix of concern and patience. The silence stretched thin between them, punctuated only by the soft hiss of the fire. Daniel broke it first. "I called someone. I called a friend of mine. She's smart, and she knows how to handle situations like this." Mark stiffened, his small fingers gripping the mug tightly. "You promised no police." "She's not the police," Daniel reassured him. "Her name is Linda. She's a prosecutor. She helps people." Mark frowned, skeptical. "She's not going to make me go back, right? To the orphanage?" "No one's going to make you do anything," Daniel said firmly. "We're going to figure this out together." Before Mark could respond, the sound of a car engine and the crunch of tires on gravel drew both their gazes to the window. A sleek black sedan pulled up, and a woman stepped out, her silhouette sharp against the glow of the porch lights. Linda strode up to the door, her heels clicking against the stone walkway, and knocked briskly. Daniel opened the door to reveal a young woman in a tailored trench coat, her dark hair swept neatly back. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, softened slightly when she saw him. "Daniel," she greeted, stepping inside and shaking off the rain. "You said it was urgent." "It is," he replied, his tone grave. "Come in. There's someone you need to meet." Linda followed him into the living room, her gaze falling on Mark. She knelt slightly to meet his eye level, offering a small, warm smile. "Hi there. You must be Mark." Mark looked at her warily, not responding. Linda didn't push. Instead, she took a seat on the couch, keeping her movements calm and unthreatening. "I'm Linda. I help people, especially kids, when they're in trouble." Mark's grip on the mug tightened, but he remained silent. Daniel leaned forward, his voice low and encouraging. "It's okay, Mark. You can trust her." Linda glanced at Daniel, a silent question in her eyes. He gave her a brief nod, then recounted what Mark had told him. As he spoke, Linda's expression darkened, her brows knitting together. When he finished, Linda turned back to Mark, her voice steady but kind. "That must have been scary for you, hearing those things. You did the right thing by telling Daniel." Mark looked down, his voice barely audible. "They said, buyers. I don't know what it means, but it sounded bad." "It does sound bad," Linda agreed softly. "And I'm going to make sure we find out exactly what's going on." She leaned back slightly, giving him space. "But I need your help, Mark. Can you tell me anything else you remember? Anything strange about the people at the orphanage?" Mark hesitated before shaking his head. "I don't know. They're always watching us, like they're waiting for something." Linda nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's helpful, Mark. Every detail matters." She turned to Daniel. "This could be bigger than we think. If he overheard what I think he did, it's likely connected to organized trafficking." Daniel's jaw tightened. "So, what do we do?" Linda's gaze shifted between Daniel and Mark. "First, he stays here. He stays somewhere safe, away from anyone who might be looking for him. I'll push for an official investigation into the orphanage, but it'll take time. We'll need evidence, something solid." Daniel nodded, his resolve hardening. Whatever it takes. Mark's gaze flicked between them, his small voice breaking the tension. "You're not going to let them take me back, right?" Daniel met his eyes, his voice firm. "No one's taking you anywhere." Linda smiled at Mark, her confidence quietly reassuring. "We'll keep you safe, Mark. I promise." Outside, the rain had started again, a slow drizzle pattering against the windows. Inside, for the first time, Mark began to feel a faint flicker of hope. The orphanage loomed like a sentinel from another era, its cracked brick facade a grim contrast to the lively playground equipment out front. Linda adjusted her scarf against the cold wind and approached to the main entrance. The brass plaque near the door read, "St. Gabriel's Home for Children," its shine dulled by years of neglect. She knocked sharply and waited, her breath visible in the icy air. After a moment, the door creaked open to reveal a woman in her late 50s, her thin face framed by iron-grey hair pulled into a severe bun. She wore a cardigan that seemed too neat, too rehearsed, like her sharp-edged smile. "You must be Ms. Fletcher," the woman said, her voice clipped. "I'm Mrs. Grayson, the director. I wasn't expecting visitors today." Linda offered a disarming smile, extending her hand. "Thank you for seeing me on short notice, Mrs. Grayson. I'm with the district prosecutor's office, looking into welfare checks for local institutions. May I come in?" Mrs. Grayson hesitated briefly before stepping aside. "Of course. We take our responsibilities here very seriously." Dimly lit, the interior featured narrow corridors and scuffed linoleum floors that squeaked underfoot. Children's laughter echoed faintly, but Linda noticed a hollow quality to it, as though it was encouraged but not felt. She followed Mrs. Grayson to a cramped office, cluttered with outdated binders and faded motivational posters. Linda eased into a chair opposite the director, her tone conversational. "It's quite the responsibility, managing so many children. How many are currently in your care?" 18, Mrs. Grayson replied smoothly, her hands folded on the desk. "We've always been a small operation." Linda nodded, her gaze drifting to a filing cabinet against the wall. "And you've had no adoptions recently?" Mrs. Grayson's lips tightened. "We do our best to find families for the children, but it's a rigorous process. Not every prospective parent meets our standards." The answer was well rehearsed, and Linda noted how Mrs. Grayson's knuckles whitened slightly as she gripped her chair. "I see. I'll need to review some of your records. Basic procedural checks, you understand?" The director stiffened, but managed another thin smile. "Of course. I'll have my assistant gather what you need." As Linda waited, she scanned the room, her eyes catching on a photograph tucked halfway behind a stack of folders. It depicted several children posing with the staff. Something about their smiles didn't sit right. They looked strained, forced. Her attention snapped back as Mrs. Grayson's assistant entered with a stack of files. "I appreciate this," Linda said, flipping through the first folder. As she skimmed the documents, subtle red flags began to emerge. Discrepancies in the children's admission dates, missing signatures on consent forms. Most glaringly, several files were conspicuously absent, their entries skipped entirely in the orphanage's logbook. "Some of these files seem incomplete," Linda said, her tone casual but probing. Mrs. Grayson's expression barely wavered. "We're in the process of digitizing our records. I'm afraid some of the older files may still be in storage." Linda gave a polite smile, but felt her pulse quicken. The evasion was too neat, too rehearsed. Meanwhile, back at Daniel's house, Mark sat cross-legged on the floor of the study, a book open on his lap. Daniel sat nearby, feigning reading as he kept a close watch on the boy. Mark's face was more relaxed now, his small fingers tracing words on the page. "You like books, huh?" Daniel asked after a long silence. Mark glanced up briefly. "Yeah, I used to hide in the library at the orphanage. Nobody bothered me there." Daniel nodded, setting his own book aside. "What kind of stories do you like?" Mark hesitated, then said, "Ones where people escape undesirable places, or where they find someone who actually cares about them." Daniel's chest tightened at the words. "That's a positive kind of story," he said softly. Mark shrugged, but Daniel could see a faint glimmer of trust in his eyes. "Do you read a lot?" the boy asked, surprising him. "I used to," Daniel admitted. "Not so much anymore." "Why not?" Daniel paused, unsure how to answer. "I guess I just stopped making time for it. Maybe I should start again." Mark gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and turned back to his book. At the orphanage, Linda wrapped up her visit, her smile polite but her mind racing. As Mrs. Grayson walked her to the door, a faint sound stopped her, a child's voice, muffled but distinct, coming from down the hall. "Is something wrong?" Mrs. Grayson asked, her smile tight. "No," Linda said quickly, forcing her gaze back to the exit. "Thank you for your time. I'll be in touch." As the door closed behind her, Linda's thoughts churned. The missing files, the nervous staff, the strange, stilted atmosphere. Everything pointed to something darker lurking beneath the surface. She pulled out her phone and dialed Daniel. "We've got a problem," she said as soon as he answered, "and it's bigger than we thought." Linda sat across from Daniel in the softly lit study, her expression shadowed by the weight of her findings. Mark was asleep upstairs, but his small, steady breaths through the baby monitor offered little comfort. "This isn't just about Mark," Linda began, her voice low but firm. "The orphanage. There are gaps in their records, files that don't add up. Is the director hiding something? She's hiding something. I'm sure of it." Daniel leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "What does that mean for him?" Linda's eyes softened, but her tone remained resolute. "It means he was right to run. If what he overheard is true, this could be big and dangerous. Daniel, you need to involve the police." Daniel frowned, glancing toward the stairs. "Do you think they'll keep him safe? I don't want him to end up back in the system. Not with this going on." "They will," Linda assured him, placing a hand lightly on the table. "But this isn't just about Mark anymore. If other children are at risk, we have to act." Reluctantly, Daniel agreed. They promptly notified the police that night. By morning, a citywide review of orphanages had begun. Subtle murmurs of suspicion spread through the community, but it wasn't long before the media caught wind of the investigation. Headlines splashed across screens and newspapers, raising urgent questions. What is happening in Philadelphia's orphanages? Daniel and Linda saw the growing attention as both beneficial and dangerous for a boy like Mark, whose safety was now in jeopardy. The media frenzy had just begun to swell when the phone call came. Daniel, seated in his living room, with Mark curled up nearby, frowned as the unknown number flashed on his screen. He answered, his voice cautious. "This is Daniel." The woman on the other end hesitated before speaking, her voice trembling slightly. "Mr. Langston, my name is Elizabeth. I believe I'm Mark's mother." Daniel froze, his eyes darting to Mark, engrossed in a book on the couch. "I'm sorry. What did you say?" "I know this must be a shock," Elizabeth continued, her tone steadying. "I've been searching for him for years. When I saw the news about the orphanage investigation, I felt compelled to reach out." Her words tumbled out in a rehearsed rush, and Daniel's skepticism flared. "How do I know this isn't some misunderstanding?" "I have proof," she replied quickly. "Hospital records, photographs. Please, I just want to see him, to explain." After a long pause, Daniel relented. "All right, come to my house tomorrow, but understand this. Mark's safety comes first." The house felt quieter than usual, though it was far from calm. Mark sat curled on the couch, his knees pulled to his chest, watching the fire flicker in the hearth. His face was tense, lost in thought, until Daniel walked in, his voice soft but tinged with unease. "Mark," he began, settling into the chair opposite him. "There's someone who wants to see you. She says she's your mother." Mark's head shot up, his eyes wide and searching. "My mum." Daniel hesitated, unsure how to temper the boy's growing hope. "She contacted me after seeing the news. She's coming over soon to talk." Mark didn't respond, but the way he straightened his back and tightened his grip on the couch cushion conveyed a powerful message. An hour later, the doorbell rang. Daniel opened the door to reveal a tall, poised woman in her early 40s. Elizabeth wore a modest, tailored coat and carried herself with a calm, almost demure grace. Her dark hair framed her face softly, but her eyes held a glint of determination. "Mr. Langston," she said, her voice warm and tinged with emotion. "Thank you for letting me come." Daniel stepped aside. "Please, come in." Elizabeth entered, her gaze immediately falling on Mark, who had risen from the couch. She froze, her eyes misting over, and then whispered, "Mark, oh, my sweet boy." Mark's breath hitched. He took a hesitant step forward, his voice cracking. "Are you really my mum?" "Yes," Elizabeth said, kneeling to his level and holding her arms out. "I've missed you so much." Mark hesitated for only a second before rushing into her embrace. His small frame trembled against hers as she held him tightly, stroking his hair and murmuring apologies. Daniel watched the scene unfold, a lump forming in his throat. For the first time, Mark looked unguarded, almost at peace. Linda arrived shortly after, her eyes narrowing slightly as she surveyed Elizabeth. She offered a polite smile, but spoke with her usual sharpness. "Elizabeth, I presume. I'm Linda Fletcher, a prosecutor working with Daniel on this case." Elizabeth straightened, her composure unshaken. "Yes, I've heard about you. Thank you for keeping Mark safe." "We're just trying to do what's best for him," Linda said, her tone neutral. "Perhaps you could share how you lost contact with Mark." Elizabeth sighed, taking a seat beside Mark. She gently held his hand as she spoke. "It's a long, painful story. I was very young when I had Mark, barely out of school. My family, they were strict, unyielding. They wouldn't allow me to keep him. I thought leaving him at the orphanage would give him a better chance. But I never stopped thinking about him." Mark looked up at her, his eyes wide with emotion. "You didn't forget about me." "Never," Elizabeth said, her voice trembling. "I wanted to find you, but I was scared. And then, when I saw your face on the news, I knew I couldn't wait any longer." Daniel's heart softened at her words. She seemed sincere, and Mark's happiness was undeniable. Perhaps, he thought, this was the ending Mark deserved, a family of his own. Linda, however, remained skeptical. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze piercing. "It's remarkable that you found him so quickly after the news broke. Do you have any documents or records proving your connection to Mark?" Elizabeth didn't flinch, producing a folder from her bag. "These are all I have, hospital records, photos. I know it's not much, but I hope it's enough." Linda took the folder, flipping through its contents with practiced efficiency. The paperwork appeared legitimate, but something felt off. A subtle inconsistency in the timeline caught her attention, but she said nothing, merely nodding and setting the folder aside. As the evening wore on, Mark began to grow more animated, clinging to Elizabeth's every word as she recounted moments from his infancy. Daniel watched them from a distance, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He wanted to believe this was real, that Mark had found the love he deserved. But Linda's unease lingered. When Elizabeth excused herself to take a phone call, Linda pulled Daniel aside. "Something's not right," she murmured. "Her story feels rehearsed. And these documents, they're solid, but they're almost too clean." Daniel frowned. "Do you think she's lying?" "I don't know yet," Linda admitted, "but I'm going to find out." For Mark's sake, Daniel hoped Linda was wrong. But as he glanced back at Elizabeth, now laughing softly with Mark, a flicker of doubt crept into his mind. The hum of Linda's desk lamp filled her quiet office as she pored over Elizabeth's documents for the third time that evening. The meticulously crafted documents included birth records, photos, and a neatly typed letter that detailed the struggles Elizabeth claimed to have faced when she had to give up Mark. Yet, something gnawed at Linda's instincts, a subtle inconsistency she couldn't shake. Her computer chimed softly, pulling her attention to the results of a database search she'd initiated earlier. The report flashed on her screen, and Linda leaned in, her brow furrowing. Elizabeth's name appeared, but the details didn't align with her story. She hadn't been living in the area during the time Mark was supposedly left at the orphanage. Instead, records placed her in another state entirely, working under an alias. Linda opened another tab, cross-referencing Elizabeth's information with local birth records. Her breath hitched as the pieces began to fall into place. Mark's biological parents had died in a fire 8 years earlier. The police report, tucked in a dusty archive, confirmed the tragedy. A neighbor had found the boy amidst the wreckage and called emergency services. The timeline didn't match Elizabeth's claims at all. Pushing her chair back, Linda dialed Daniel's number. The line clicked, his voice groggy but alert. "Linda, what's wrong?" "You need to hear this," she said, her voice tense. Mark's parents didn't abandon him. They died in a fire. The records are clear. Elizabeth was nowhere near the area when Mark was born. "She's lying, Daniel." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Daniel asked, "Why would she go to such lengths? What does she want?" "That's the part I'm still piecing together," Linda admitted, "but she's not who she claims to be. I need to confront her and see how she reacts." The following afternoon, Linda stood at a quiet cafe downtown, her sharp eyes fixed on Elizabeth as she approached. Elizabeth greeted her with a measured smile, her demeanor calm and poised. "Thank you for meeting me," Elizabeth said as she sat across from Linda. "I assume you have questions. Having a mother is a wonderful thing in life. Do you live with your mother? If so, comment sunflower. If you are away from her, comment tulip. We want to send you hugs. Linda didn't waste any time. Your story doesn't add up, Elizabeth. You weren't in this city when Mark was born, and his parents, his real parents, didn't abandon him. They died in a fire. Care to explain? Elizabeth's smile faltered for the briefest moment before she quickly recovered. I must have misremembered some details, she said, her tone still smooth. It was a long time ago, and it was a traumatic period for me. That's convenient, Linda replied, her voice cool. But the evidence doesn't misremember. You're not Mark's mother. So who are you? Elizabeth's composure cracked. She straightened her posture, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Miss Fletcher, I don't appreciate the accusations of lying. I've been nothing but honest. Honest? Linda leaned forward, her voice sharp. You falsified documents and constructed a narrative that lacks credibility. What's your connection to the orphanage, Elizabeth? And why are you so interested in Mark? Elizabeth stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. I don't have to sit here and endure interrogation, she abruptly said. If you want answers, I suggest you speak to my lawyer. With that, she stormed out of the cafe, leaving Linda to watch her retreating figure with a grim expression. She pulled out her phone and began typing notes, documenting the confrontation. Elizabeth's reaction had confirmed her suspicions. There was more to her story, and it wasn't anything good. Back at her office, Linda dove deeper into her investigation. She expanded her search into known trafficking operations, cross-referencing names and locations tied to the orphanage. Patterns began to emerge: missing children, suspicious transfers, and Elizabeth's connections to several dubious individuals. The puzzle pieces began to form a chilling picture. By midnight, Linda had compiled a preliminary report. She stared at her findings, the weight of the truth pressing down on her. Elizabeth wasn't just lying about being Mark's mother. She was working for the same trafficking ring that Mark had overheard at the orphanage, and now, Linda realized, their interest in him wasn't coincidental. Linda picked up her phone and called Daniel again. When Daniel answered, she didn't hold back. It's worse than we thought. Elizabeth has a connection to the trafficking ring. They're using her to get close to Mark. Daniel's voice was tight with anger. What do we do now? We need to move fast, Linda said. Mark is still their target, and Elizabeth knows we're onto her. We can't let her slip away. As she ended the call, Linda leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. The truth had finally surfaced, but the fight was far from over. For Mark's sake, they had to act, and act quickly. The soft creak of a floorboard shattered the stillness of Daniel's house as the clock struck midnight. Outside, shadows lingered in the glow of a distant street lamp. Inside, Daniel sat on the edge of his bed, restless. The events of the day churned in his mind. Linda's warning replayed over and over. Elizabeth is part of the trafficking ring. Downstairs, a faint thud broke the silence. Daniel froze, his heart racing. He reached for his phone, his fingers brushing the screen, when a muffled sound, like the scuff of a shoe against hardwood, made his blood run cold. He bolted out of the room and down the hall, instinctively heading for Mark's room. The door was ajar. Inside, the bed was empty, the sheets tangled and thrown to the side. A single slipper lay abandoned on the floor. "Mark!" Daniel shouted, panic clawing at his throat. He rushed to the window, yanking it open. Cold air rushed in, but there was no sign of movement outside. Earlier that evening, across town, Elizabeth sat in the back of a dimly lit bar. An edginess betrayed her desperation, replacing her polished demeanor. She leaned across the table toward a man in a dark jacket. Shadows obscured his face, but his voice was sharp and impatient. He hissed, You should have delivered the boy by now. Do you know how much heat we're under because of you? Elizabeth's fingers trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. I had to build their trust. They were watching me too closely. I just need a little more time. You're out of time, the man snapped. If you don't bring him in tonight, you'll have more to worry about than losing their trust. Elizabeth's jaw tightened. I'll get it done. At Daniel's house, chaos erupted as he tore through the rooms, shouting Mark's name. He grabbed his phone and called Linda. The line rang twice before she answered, her voice groggy but alert. Linda, he's gone, Daniel said, his voice shaking. Mark's gone. Linda's breath caught. Is he no longer with us? I don't know how, but someone took him. I heard a disturbance downstairs, and upon inspecting his room, I found him gone. Linda's voice hardened. I'm on my way. Call the police and lock the house. Don't touch anything. Daniel hung up, his hands trembling as he dialed 911. The operator's calm voice did little to soothe his panic as he explained the situation. Within minutes, flashing lights bathed the street outside as officers began combing the area. Linda arrived not long after, her coat thrown hastily over her pajamas. She stormed into the house, her eyes blazing. What happened? She demanded. Daniel gestured toward Mark's room. I don't know. He was asleep and then he wasn't. The window was open, but there's no sign of how they got in. Linda inspected the room, her sharp eyes catching small details, a faint scuff mark on the windowsill, a strand of thread snagged on the latch. She turned to Daniel. They had planned this. They knew exactly what they were doing. Daniel slumped into a chair, his hands covering his face. I failed him. I let this happen. You didn't fail anyone, Linda said firmly, her voice cutting through his despair. They targeted him because they knew how much you care. But we're going to get him back. I promise you that. Across town, Mark sat in the back of a van, his hands trembling as he clutched the edges of the seat. Elizabeth sat beside him, her face unreadable in the dim light. I don't understand, Mark whispered, his voice small. I thought you were my mum. Elizabeth didn't respond. Her jaw clenched as she stared out the window. Tears welled in Mark's eyes, his voice breaking. Why are you doing this? Elizabeth finally turned to him, her expression cold. It's not about you, Mark. It's bigger than that. Mark recoiled, his small frame shrinking further into the corner of the van. Back at Daniel's house, Linda coordinated with the police, her tone clipped and professional. She issued orders, pushing them to widen their search radius and tap into nearby surveillance cameras. But beneath her steely exterior, fear gnawed at her. Mark's time was slipping away, and the city's underbelly was vast and unforgiving. As dawn approached, Linda placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, her voice resolute, despite the exhaustion in her eyes. We're not stopping until we find him. Daniel nodded, his expression grim. He would do anything for Mark. And for the first time in years, he prayed silently, desperate for a miracle. The industrial outskirts of Philadelphia were a labyrinth of derelict warehouses and dimly lit alleys. The air smelled of rust and damp asphalt, and the faint hum of machinery echoed in the distance. It was here, amid the shadows, that Elizabeth had taken Mark. The van screeched to a halt outside a decrepit building, its walls marred by graffiti and decay. Get out, Elizabeth ordered, her tone cold and devoid of the warmth she once feigned. Mark hesitated, his small frame trembling as he glanced toward the building. Please, he whispered, his voice breaking. Just let me go. Elizabeth's jaw tightened, and she grabbed his arm, dragging him out of the van. Move, she barked, her grip firm and unyielding. Back at Daniel's home, Linda stood at the center of the makeshift command post she'd set up in the living room. Linda spread a map of the city across the coffee table, dotted with pins marking suspected trafficking locations. Officers moved in and out, relaying updates, while Daniel paced the room, his fists clenched. "We're tracking Elizabeth's last known location," Linda said, her voice calm but urgent. She pointed to a spot on the map. A traffic camera caught the van heading toward the industrial district. "It's a dead zone. No active businesses. Few cameras. They're smart." Daniel stopped pacing, his expression grim. "Then we need to outsmart them." He pulled out his phone, dialing a contact in the private security firm he'd used for years. "I need every resource you have. Drones, surveillance teams, anything. Start combing the industrial district." Linda glanced at him, a flicker of gratitude crossing her face. "That'll help, but we need more than eyes. We need leverage." Daniel nodded. "Then we use my network. I'll call everyone I know who has connections in this city. Someone will know something." Inside the warehouse, Mark's mind raced. He'd always been clever, a quick thinker who noticed the small details others overlooked. Now, those skills were his only chance. As Elizabeth pushed him into a dark room and locked the door, he scanned his surroundings. A stack of crates, loose wires on the floor, and a shattered window high on the wall. His eyes landed on a small, dusty notepad and a stub of a pencil on a nearby crate. He grabbed them quickly, scribbling what little he could remember of the route they'd taken. Landmarks, turns, the sound of a train nearby. He tore the page out, folding it tightly and slipping it into his sock. Mark's heart pounded as he heard voices outside the door. The tones of Elizabeth and another man were sharp and heated. "This wasn't the plan," the man snapped. "We should remain unseen, not attract notice." "We didn't have a choice," Elizabeth shot back. "The kid's worth too much. We can't just let him go." Mark pressed himself against the crates, his breath shallow. His mind raced. If he couldn't escape, he had to leave clues for someone to find him. Linda's phone buzzed with an update. She swiped the screen, her sharp eyes scanning the message. "We've got movement," she said, her tone clipped. "A drone picked up activity near an abandoned warehouse. It matches the van's description." Daniel firmly grasped his coat, his expression unwavering. "Let's go." "No," Linda said firmly. "Let me handle this. You'll only complicate things if you go charging in." Daniel's eyes narrowed, but before he could argue, Linda softened her tone. "I know you want to protect him, but the best way to do that is to let me and the team handle it. I promise we'll bring him back." Reluctantly, Daniel stepped back, his jaw tightening. "You'd better." As Linda and a team of officers approached the warehouse, she signaled for silence. The building loomed before them, its windows dark and uninviting. Linda's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay focused. She motioned for the team to spread out, each officer taking a different entry point. Inside, Mark crouched behind the crates, clutching the notepad page in his sock like a lifeline. The voices outside the door grew louder, angrier. He glanced at the shattered window high above, and an idea sparked. Grabbing a loose wire, he fashioned a crude hook, tossing it toward the window latch. It took several tries, but finally, the latch clicked open. Mark scrambled up the crates, the paper still tucked away. He pushed the window open, the cold night air rushing in. His small frame barely fit through the gap, but he managed to squeeze out, dropping into the alley below. His knees buckled on impact, but he forced himself to move, leaving the folded paper wedged under a loose brick near the building's corner. Linda spotted the open window just as her team breached the warehouse. Shouts echoed inside as officers secured the building, but Linda's eyes locked on the faint tracks leading away from the alley. She knelt, finding the folded note tucked under the brick. Unfolding it, she read Mark's shaky handwriting. Train tracks, left on Maple, Red Warehouse. Her chest tightened with a mix of pride and urgency. "He's leaving clues," she murmured. She called out to the team, her voice commanding, "Fan out, he's nearby." As the hunt intensified, Linda's resolve hardened. Mark's bravery and cunning had provided them with valuable time, and she vowed not to let it slip away. Mark was waiting in the shadows of Philadelphia, and Linda would not stop until she brought him home. The Red Warehouse loomed against the night sky, its rusted walls a silent witness to the horrors within. Inside, the air was thick with dampness and the faint stench of oil. Shadows stretched and shifted as Elizabeth paced the room where Mark sat huddled against the wall. Her calm facade had cracked, revealing the desperation beneath. "You need to understand, Mark," she said, crouching to meet his eye level. "Daniel and Linda don't care about you. They only see you as a tool, a burden they'll soon get sick of. I'm the only one who can protect you." Mark stared at her, his small frame trembling, but his eyes glinted with defiance. "You're lying," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "Daniel promised he wouldn't leave me. And Linda, she's not like you." Elizabeth's jaw tightened, and for a moment, anger flared in her eyes. "You're a smart kid, but you're naive. People always leave, Mark. Trust me, I've seen it." Before she could say more, the faint sound of footsteps outside the warehouse made her freeze. She straightened, her head snapping toward the door. "Stay here," she ordered, her voice sharp. She locked the door behind her and disappeared into the shadows. Outside, Linda coordinated with the officers, her voice low but firm. "We've got multiple entries. Secure all exits first. No one leaves this place." Daniel stood in the shadows outside the Red Warehouse, his heart pounding in time with the distant rumble of passing trains. The night was eerily quiet, the cold seeping into his bones. He had ignored Linda's plea to stay behind, tracking her team's location using a GPS ping from her phone. The thought of Mark out there, scared and alone, had overridden all logic. From his vantage point, Daniel observed Linda. She was calm and methodical, her hand raised to signal silence as they spread out around the warehouse. Daniel pulled his hood tighter, staying out of sight, but close enough to act if needed. "Daniel, this isn't a game," Linda warned, her sharp gaze fixed on him. "You might sustain injuries, or worse." "I'm not sitting on the sidelines while Mark is in there," he shot back, his tone resolute. Linda hesitated, then relented. "Fine, but you follow my lead. Stay close, and don't do anything reckless." They moved together, slipping into the warehouse through a side door. Inside, the dim light cast eerie shadows, and the muffled sounds of voices echoed through the cavernous space. Linda gestured for Daniel to stay back as she signaled to the officers to advance. Elizabeth met with her associates in a small office at the back of the warehouse. "We need to move him," she hissed. "The cops are closing in." The man she spoke to, burly and unshaven, sneered. "You're the one who screwed this up, Elizabeth. Why should we clean up your mess?" "You don't have a choice," she snapped. "They'll find us if we stay." The sound of splintering wood and shouts echoing through the building cut short their argument. Panic spread across Elizabeth's face as she realized they were out of time. Mark, still locked in the small room, heard the commotion outside. His heart leapt with hope. They're here. The door burst open, and for a moment he froze, expecting Elizabeth. Instead, he saw Daniel, his face pale but determined. "Mark!" Daniel called, rushing to him. Mark stumbled to his feet and into Daniel's arms, his small hands clutching at Daniel's jacket. "You came," he whispered. "Of course I did," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "I promised, didn't I?" Linda appeared in the doorway, her expression tight with relief. We need to move. Now." In the main warehouse, chaos erupted as officers cornered the traffickers. Elizabeth, realizing she had no escape, grabbed a pipe from the floor and faced Linda as she entered the room. "You think you've won?" Elizabeth snarled, her voice trembling with fury. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Linda's voice was calm, but cutting. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, a liar and a criminal who preys on children." Elizabeth lunged, but Linda sidestepped her easily, disarming her with a sharp twist of her wrist. The pipe clattered to the floor, and Elizabeth fell to her knees, gasping. "You used Mark," Linda said, her voice cold. "You lied to him, manipulated him. But he's stronger than you thought, and he doesn't need you." Elizabeth glared at her, but the fight had drained from her. Officers moved in, cuffing her and the remaining traffickers. As the officers led them away, Linda turned to Daniel and Mark, her shoulders finally relaxing for the first time in hours. "It's over," she said softly. Daniel nodded, holding Mark tightly. "It's over." Mark looked up at Linda, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. Linda smiled, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You're safe now, Mark. That's all that matters." As the night gave way to the first rays of dawn, the warehouse stood silent, a monument to the battle fought and won. Held securely in Daniel's arms, Mark finally allowed himself to believe that he was safe and that he was no longer alone. The sun had barely risen when the convoy of police cars and vans pulled into the station. The grim silence of the officers contrasted sharply with the piercing wails of sirens. Inside the van, Elizabeth sat cuffed, her once composed face now etched with fury and desperation. Beside her, two of her accomplices sat silently, their heads bowed, resigned to their fate. Linda followed close behind, her mind still racing. The traffickers were in custody, but her work was far from over. She had not yet dismantled the orphanage, which served as the core of her operation. The children left behind there haunted her thoughts. As soon as Elizabeth was processed, Linda was determined to push forward with the next phase of the investigation. In a small room at the station, Mark sat quietly in a chair, clutching a warm blanket that an officer had draped over his shoulders. Daniel knelt in front of him, his hands gently holding Mark's. "You're safe now," he said softly. "No one's ever going to hurt you again." Mark nodded, his lip trembling. "I was so scared," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I thought you wouldn't come." Daniel's chest tightened, and he pulled Mark into a firm hug. "I'll always come for you, Mark. Always." Nearby, Linda watched them with a faint smile before stepping forward. "Mark," she said gently, "I want you to know something. We're going to make sure this doesn't happen to any other kid. I'm going to stop the people who did this." Mark looked up at her, his eyes wide. "The people at the orphanage?" Linda crouched to meet his gaze. "Yes, they collaborated with the criminals who kidnapped you. But I promise you, they're not going to get away with it." Mark's small hands gripped the blanket tighter. "What about the other kids? Will you save them too?" Linda's voice softened, her resolve shining through. "Yes, Mark. Every single one of them." Meanwhile, in the interrogation room, Elizabeth sat across from Linda, her cuffs clinking lightly against the metal table. Her demeanor had shifted again, calm, almost smug. "You think this ends here?" she sneered. "You have no idea how deep this goes." Linda's expression didn't waver. "Then why don't you enlighten me?" Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, her lips curling into a sly smile. "You've caught a few minnows, Fletcher, but the sharks, they're still out there, and they're smarter than you think." Linda's jaw tensed, yet she declined to succumb to the temptation. Smarter, maybe. However, they are by no means invincible. I'll find them. Elizabeth's laughter was cold and hollow. Good luck with that. Who are the people I work for? They'll make sure this all disappears before you even know where to look. Linda rose slowly, towering over Elizabeth. We'll see about that, she said, her tone ice-cold. Enjoy your time here, Elizabeth. You'll have plenty of it. By late morning, Linda had compiled a comprehensive report, her evidence linking the orphanage directly to the trafficking operation. She met with the police chief and legal teams, coordinating an immediate raid on St. Gabriel's Home for Children. There would be no mercy for those who preyed on the innocent. As the day wore on, Daniel and Mark returned to Daniel's home, their sanctuary from the chaos. Mark seemed lighter somehow, his small hand clutching Daniel's as they walked through the door. The familiar warmth of the house greeted them, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Mark smiled. "Do you want to read for a bit?" Daniel asked, his voice gentle. Mark nodded eagerly. "Can we read the one about the explorers?" "Of course," Daniel said, pulling the book from the shelf and settling beside Mark on the couch. As Daniel began to read, his voice steady and soothing, Mark leaned against him, his eyelids drooping. Mark fell asleep for the first time in days, feeling safe and secure in the knowledge of his love. Back at the station, Linda received a call from the team at the orphanage. The raid had been a success. The director and her staff were in custody, while the remaining children were now safe and under protective care. Linda allowed herself a brief moment of relief. She thought of Mark and the courage he'd shown, even in the darkest moments. He had been the key to unraveling this entire operation. Now, thanks to him, countless other children would have a chance at freedom and safety. As she hung up the phone, Linda's resolve hardened. Elizabeth's cryptic warnings still echoed in her mind. The sharks were out there, waiting, but so was she. This fight was far from over, and she intended to win. The evening sunlight filtered through the windows of Daniel's home, casting a warm golden glow over the living room. The space, once pristine and sterile, had transformed into a sanctuary. A blanket casually draped over the couch, while books and toys littered the coffee table. The faint aroma of freshly baked cookies from the kitchen filled the air, a stark contrast to the tension that had gripped them just days before. Mark sat cross-legged on the floor, a small set of building blocks spread out before him. He carefully constructed a tower, his face etched with concentration. Daniel watched from the armchair, his heart swelling at the sight. For the first time in what felt like forever, Mark seemed at ease. "You've got quite the architect's mind," Daniel remarked, his voice light. Mark looked up and gave a shy smile. "I like making things. It's calming." Daniel nodded. "Well, you're welcome to build anything you want here. This is your home now." Mark's smile grew a little wider, and he returned to his task. Across the room, Linda leaned against the doorway, watching the scene with a quiet sense of satisfaction. She stepped into the room, carrying a stack of papers. "Daniel," she said, holding out the documents. "The adoption procedure is underway. I've already fast-tracked the preliminary approvals. Everything is in motion." Daniel took the papers, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at Mark, absorbed in his blocks, and then returned his attention to Linda. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Linda offered a small smile. "You don't need to thank me. Mark deserves a real family, and you're giving him that." Later that evening, Daniel led Mark upstairs to his new bedroom. Posters of explorers and galaxies now adorned the once bare walls, reflecting Mark's love for adventure. Shelves held an assortment of books, from stories about brave heroes to encyclopedias about the natural world. A plush bear sat on the neatly made bed, waiting for him. Mark hesitated at the doorway, his eyes wide as he took it all in. "This is mine," he whispered. Daniel placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "We'll cover every aspect of it. And if there's anything else you want, we'll make it happen." Mark stepped into the room, running his fingers along the bookshelves. He picked up the bear, holding it tightly. "I've never had a room like this before," he admitted, his voice small. "Well," Daniel said, kneeling to his level, "you deserve it. And more." Mark looked up at him, his eyes glistening. "Thank you, Daniel." "You're welcome, kiddo," Daniel said softly, pulling him into a hug. Downstairs, Linda sat at the kitchen table, reviewing case files. She sipped her coffee, her mind still racing with the remnants of the investigation. She heard footsteps and looked up to see Daniel entering, a worn but content expression on his face. "He loves his room," Daniel said, leaning against the counter. "Thank you for helping with all of this." Linda shook her head. "You're the one who's made this a home for him. I just pushed a little paper around." Daniel chuckled lightly. "Still, I couldn't have done any of this without you." They shared a moment of quiet, the weight of the past days still lingering between them. Then Daniel spoke again, his tone more serious. "You're incredible. You know that? The way you fought for Mark, for all those kids." Linda glanced down at her coffee, a faint blush rising to her cheeks. "I just did my job." Daniel moved closer, his gaze steady. "No, Linda. You did more than that. You cared. You made a difference." She looked up at him, their eyes meeting. For the first time, the barriers they'd built around themselves seemed to fade. "It's simple to care when you're fighting for someone like Mark," she said softly. "And for someone like you," Daniel added. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full of understanding, of something unspoken but deeply felt. For the first time, they weren't just partners in a mission. They were something more. As the night deepened, Daniel and Linda sat on the couch, talking quietly while Mark slept upstairs. The weight of their shared experiences bound them together in a way neither could have anticipated. They knew there were more battles ahead, but for now, they allowed themselves a moment of peace, a moment to heal. In the glow of the firelight, Daniel glanced at Linda and smiled. "We make a pretty formidable team." Linda returned the smile, a spark of hope in her eyes. "Yeah, we do." A sunlit atrium in the heart of Philadelphia held the press conference, its glass walls offering a panoramic view of the city that had seen so much pain. And now, a glimmer of hope. The room was filled with journalists and cameras, focusing their lenses on a sleek podium that displayed the emblem of the newly established Mark Crawford Foundation for Child Protection. Daniel stood at the podium, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the raw emotion etched into his face. To his right, Linda stood poised but relaxed, her presence a reassuring anchor. And beside Daniel, Mark stood tall, his hand firmly clasping Daniel's. The boy's shy smile and steady gaze captivated the room. He had grown so much in such a short time, his resilience shining through. Daniel began, his voice steady but brimming with conviction. "Good morning. Today is not just about launching a foundation. It's about taking a stand. A stand against the exploitation of children, against the systems that allow such horrors to exist." He paused, glancing down at Mark, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. "This foundation is named after Mark, not only because of what he endured, but because of who he is, a symbol of courage, resilience, and hope. We will use every resource at our disposal to protect vulnerable children, dismantle trafficking networks, and rebuild lives." Applause erupted in the room, But Daniel was far from finished. He leaned into the microphone, his voice softening. Mark reminded me of something we often forget, that even in our darkest moments, there's a spark of light. And it's our duty to protect that light, to nurture it. This foundation is just the beginning. Back at Daniel's home that evening, the atmosphere was one of quiet celebration. The house buzzed with warmth as Linda, Daniel, and Mark sat around the dining table, sharing pizza and laughter. Mark, once hesitant to speak, now animatedly recounted his favorite part of the press conference. "When all the cameras flashed," Mark said, his face lighting up, "I felt like a movie star." "You look like one too," Linda teased, ruffling his hair. "But you were much braver than any actor I've seen." Mark beamed at the praise, his eyes flicking to Daniel for affirmation. Daniel grinned. "She's right. You were the star of the show, kiddo." As dinner wound down, Linda noticed Mark stifling a yawn. "Bedtime, superstar," she said gently. Mark frowned, but didn't argue. "Okay, but can you read me the Explorer book again?" Daniel chuckled. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." Later, with Mark tucked into bed and his soft breaths filling the room, Daniel and Linda found themselves on the couch, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. The gravity of the day's events hung between them, but so did a quiet sense of accomplishment. "Did you see him today?" Daniel asked, breaking the silence. "How did he stand there? So sure of himself?" Daniel asked. Linda nodded, her gaze distant but fond. "He's come a long way. You've given him something no one else ever did. A family." Daniel looked at her, his expression tender. "We gave him that, Linda. Together." She smiled, leaning back against the cushions. "I suppose we did." A comfortable silence fell over them, and then Daniel spoke again, his voice tinged with vulnerability. "You know, I didn't think I could ever feel this way again. About family, about building something real." Linda turned to him, her eyes searching his. "And now?" "Now," he said softly, "I can't imagine my life without it. Without him. Without you." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Linda didn't look away. "You're not alone in that, Daniel." For a moment, neither spoke. Then, Daniel reached for her hand, his fingers curling gently around hers. The firelight danced across their faces, illuminating the quiet understanding that had grown between them. Upstairs, Mark stirred in his sleep, clutching his plush bear. His dreams were peaceful, filled with adventures and the laughter of the two people who had become his world. Downstairs, Daniel and Linda remained on the couch, their bond deepening with every shared word, every unspoken promise. Together, they had faced the darkness and found light. Together, they were building something unbreakable, a family, a future, and a new beginning. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.